What's up, Boopers? Hope you guys are ready for a history lesson, because I heard a lot of people saying Black Desert Online doesn't have any story, but it's there, you just gotta find it. So here's the spoiler-free lore of our world of Black Desert. Let's get started. Boop. Now first we've got the Ancients. Not much is known about these guys, except for that they were extremely good at manipulating the power and energy of black stones. They used the power of stones to craft constructs which still remain to guard their artifacts and relics. They were also able to use the power of black stones to revive themselves, to live a second life where their aging was slowed. They were very powerful and worshipped by many of the other races, one famous ancient being named Idana, who was much more humble about his powers than therefore respected by a race called Kabua. Not much is known about what happened to these ancients, but there was a gigantic tower crafted by the ancients infused with a ton of blackstone energy, which now resides in the middle of the desert. Now the tower, upon its completion, did something to the blackstones that was said to bring them to life and enraged many of the savage races of the land. So fast forward a bit, human civilization has grown greatly, but the knowledge of the Blackstones and their power has been mostly lost. In the west, the world is divided into four regions of Calpheon, Keplan, Heidel, and Olvia, and towards the east is the nation of Media, and further east is the great desert kingdom of Valencia. Trade begins between these nations, and it isn't long before the western four nations are being devastated by a plague called the Black Death. The plague takes away a large portion of the population of these four nations, and it was known for rotting their flesh black. The plague made people wary of each other, and they stopped visiting each other, and those believed to be infected were exiled or abandoned, including their children, and had their belongings burned. Titles of royalty and nobility quickly lost their value as people of all ranks succumbed to the disease. The plague eventually disappeared as fast as it had appeared, but not before leaving its mark, and the peasants and nobility alike lost faith in the popular religion of the time, Elian, as all their prayers for salvation had gone unanswered. Now the surviving nobility of the four nations desperately sought out someone to blame to steer the anger of their people somewhere, and after gathering in Calpheon for a great meeting, they decided the plague was caused by trading with Valencia far to the east. The priests of Elian then declared that the disaster was a result of Valencian heretics meddling in black stone alchemy, something that the people of the west did not know anything about, thus making it very easy for them to believe. From this, the kings of Calpheon, Keplan, Heidel, and Olvia formed an alliance to war against Valencia under the pretense of gaining control of the desert to stop Valencia heretics from using its blackstones, as the Valencia desert was known to have the largest reserve of blackstones in the world, thus giving it the nickname the Black Desert. With the populations lowered, the lower class became more aware of their value during this time and thus were promised larger wages in compensation for the war, and the Great Valencian War began. Now it wasn't long into the war that the blackened corpses of the Valencians made it obvious that they too had suffered from the plague, and the Elian priests were kind of ridiculed for their proclamations against Valencia as being heretics and causing the plague onto others. Many of the priests were kind of thought to be a joke, and the religion lost a lot of its respect, but regardless of this, the war raged on out of hatred, which they all had a lot of hatred after the plague had destroyed a lot of their lives and loved ones. In order to battle with Valencia and to control the desert, the forces of the West continent had to travel through Media, and because of this, Media grew more and more with each expedition. Media had been surviving on trading and accumulating wealth by supplying the Alliance expeditions by first selling them swords, then guns and cannons, and large mines were developed in the southern Media region to keep up with the demand. Media also seemed to know much more about the Blackstones than the other countries. Valencia had been known to use the Blackstones of the desert for surviving cold nights and cooking, and the Alliance had begun hauling massive amounts of blackstones out of the desert with each expedition to deprive Valencia of this. Media took advantage of this and told the Alliance they needed blackstones in order to melt metals and make gunpowder for their weapons, and hearing this, the Calpheon Alliance was happy to share some of theirs in order to reduce the expedition costs. At this time, both Calpheon and Valencia were unaware of the true value, and Media was able to stockpile the blackstones. Now throughout the war, the king of Valencia, Emir Narses, forged a name for himself as the demon who brings disaster. He continuously was able to destroy the Alliance forces, though numbers were always against him. He's kind of like the anti-Zerg king. And after 30 years of war in the desert, because of his efforts, not once did the Alliance even reach the walls of Valencia. The war finally ended, however, when the current king of Calpheon, King Dahad Sarik, and most of his troops were buried under a horrible sandstorm in the Valencia desert. The sandstorms got worse, and this was just the beginning. Not only sandstorms, but tidal waves engulfed seaside towns and their boats, highlands were ravaged by heavy rains, and the world was reshaped by raging hurricanes. The tropical regions beyond the desert began to dry up and the land began to crack. It was said that though the plague changed the people, these disasters changed the world. The weather caused a major migration of many of the savage races across the world. The Fogans were forced to leave their jungles and took refuge in the Serendian swamp, pushing the Nagas out. Ogres and orcs migrated towards Calpheon, and other savage tribes such as the Sonal settled in different areas. Media also suffered to the savages as many savage tribes invaded their southern mines and took over. With the expeditions taking huge tolls on the forces of all the nations, the savages had an easy time encroaching on the territories of these different nations and forced the nations to stop the war and look inward to defend their land, breaking up the alliance in favor of self-preservation. Over time, communication between the four regions weakened and became non-existent, as did their defining borders, as they lost control to the settling savage tribes. The Harpies, Orcs, Fogons, Ogres, Goblins, Catfish, etc. After 7 years of battling to maintain their land, the four nations had no choice but to establish trade again with Valencia through the help of Media, and the King of Calpheon allowed trade guilds to once again trade with Valencia despite protests from Elian priests. When the first caravans reached Media, they saw it was a completely different city. Though the southern lands and mines fell to the savages, the north was lined with fortifications, with confident soldiers lining the walls, holding guns and standing next to cannons. The cities were alive with smoke rising from their smokestacks. The Calpheon Merchant Guild tried to find out how Media had done so well, but found nothing within Media itself, and instead found a lead in the Black Desert. They found that the Valencia soldiers were now guarding the desert heavily, a bit more than anyone would likely guard a resource used just for lighting their stoves to keep themselves warm at night. So the merchants smuggled some black stones back to Calpheon and sent them to their alchemists. It wasn't long before they learned that the stories from the Elian priests about the magical properties of black stones were found to be true, and Keplan, Heidel, and Olvia quickly caught on to this. The nations began racing to find black stones in their land. The first to find it was Keplan, in the mountains. The stones they found in their mines had many impurities, but Media sought to buy them from Keplan nonetheless. Media was desperate for more blackstones now because Valencia had outlawed the trade of blackstones after the war. The next stock of stones was found on the Nagas in the swamp of Serendia. The Nagas had been wearing the stones as pieces of jewelry. Now the stones in the swamp were so pure that the Media merchants traveled to see them themselves. Calpheon continued searching their land, but no matter how much they looked, they could not find any source of blackstones in their land. They knew that they would lose their position of the strongest nation on the western continent if they could not secure their own supply of blackstone. They wanted the stones of Serendia's swamp, but their lower class was still weak from the plague, the wars, and the disasters, as well as the savages pillaging their lands. In order to wage war, they would need a lot of money. So the king of Calpheon, at the time, the son of the previous king, Guy Serek, began raising his funds by convincing the priests of Elian that the war would be a chance to reclaim the former glory of Elian, and promised the merchant guilds the ability to raise their own armies to compete with Media merchant guilds, and thus a war for blackstones began. Keplan was the first nation to fall to Calpheon, as they stood between them and Serendia, but the forces of Heidel were not so easily beaten. Two famous warriors of Heidel, Cliff and Armstrong, held the two watchtowers that stood between Calpheon and Heidel. After several bloody clashes, the towers still stood strong and Guy Serek was unable to defeat them, So instead, the king Seric had his forces stand off against the watchtowers and organized a small group of about 300 elite soldiers to ride across the river to Heidel in the cover of night. The forces of Heidel were hopeless. They were caught completely off guard, and while Cliff did head back to try and help his king back in Heidel from the watchtowers, by the time he got there, it was already burning. Guy Seric was nowhere to be found, and neither was the king of Heidel, Crucio. The forces of Calpheon charged at the watchtowers at the sight of the fires burning in Heidel, but the bigger problem for Heidel was that their king was kidnapped. Guy Seric then sent a message to Cliff that the king would be set free under 3 conditions. The first condition would be that Heidel would be no longer allowed to have an army, and not near the watchtowers at all. The watchtowers were to become a neutral zone. Number 2, all of Heidel's diplomacy would now be handled by Calpheon, and 3, the black stones of the Serendia swamp would now belong to Calpheon. It was about a year until the surrender happened and Crucio was allowed back to Heidel, and Olvia surrendered to Calpheon without a fight, leaving Calpheon as the sole ruler of the continent. With black stones now pouring into Calpheon from Keplan and Serendia swamp, Guy Seric turned his attention back to the Black Desert. He wanted to take control of all black stones and retake the region that his father was buried under. But he knew an alliance with Heidel would not likely happen, and he wouldn't be able to even make it past Media without strong support. So Guy Seric turned to mercenaries. He needed more money to hire them, and he was impatient and not willing to wait for blackstones to pile up from the swamp and the mines, so up went the taxes again, something that Guy Seric should not have done. They went up so high and destroyed the peace of the lower class that they had finally just found after all the savages and storms and the wars. The priests were also taxed as well, and Guy Seric took over the merchant guild armies that he had just allowed them to build. Basically, he's just pissing everybody off. His greed for blackstones and power went out of control, but the feudal system had long been broken by the plague, and the lower class knew their worth. Wealth was led by trade, not kings and nobility. It wasn't long before Guy Seric was killed by a poisoned drink, and he passed without living to take over the Black Desert or find his buried father. In its place, the Callus, a parliamentary government with senators representing each class, was set up in Calpheon. So that sets us up for Calpheon present day, but let's take a little closer look at Heidel, the main focus of Black Desert Online's story. Crucio, the king of Heidel, after returning to Heidel a year after being captured, was forced to declare the watchtowers a neutral zone, which was quickly settled in by Red Orcs. Despite everything that happened, both Cliff and Armstrong respected Crucio's decision to surrender. Many said he was a coward behind his back, but this did not faze him. What did trouble him was the sight of the Calpheon extractors in the Serendia marshlands. It wasn't long after this that Crucio fell ill. When Guy Seric died from poison, his death shocked the entire West continent. It was announced he died of an unknown disease, but the rumors spread of it being poison and murder. Crucio believed that this would leave Calpheon weak from the vacuum for power and summoned Cliff from the Western Guard camp to talk about whether they should annul the treaty and attack Calpheon. But Cliff said that this would only give Calpheon a cause to unite against and said it would be smarter to wait it out. The Grand Chamberlain, Jordine, present during this conversation, was a man recommended by Cliff to serve in Crucio's court after Crucio's illness set in. Jordine argued that since Seric's murder was likely the work of the church or merchant groups and not of a power struggle, Heidel's actions would be irrelevant to Calpheon uniting and that they should crush Calpheon during this time. Crucio, however, decided to follow Cliff's advice instead, and the disorder of Calpheon actually settled much more quickly than any of them anticipated, with the forming of the Callus. Now, Jordine had lost both his parents the night that Calpheon had attacked Heidel, and he had some pretty strong hatred for Calpheon because of this. And he continued to pressure Crucio to fight against Calpheon, convincing Crucio that Calpheon would lose its power within 5 years. He convinced Crucio to raise the taxes in Heidel in order to rebuild their army within those 5 years under the pretense of rebuilding the Heidel castle. Just like in Calpheon, the Heidel peasants were not happy with raised taxes. They had a bad harvest year, the savages were still aggressive, and now high taxes? Hells no! The peasants, seeing the Callus form as a parliamentary government in Calpheon, decided they would try something similar and sent their representative, an ex-military officer Alundi, to represent them and convince Crucio and Jordine to lower the taxes. Now, as a warning to the peasants, they imprisoned and tortured Alundi and then threw him out into the neutral territory. Now, the peasants were really pissed about this, and they kind of began an uprising, but they didn't really attack anybody. Anytime they saw soldiers, they ran away. But if they were a part of the uprising, bounties were placed on any peasants' heads, and they were unable to return back to their normal lives, so instead they gathered around Alundi and took refuge in the old castle grounds of Heidel. The uprising gave Jordine more excuses to raise the taxes, and the continuing hardships helped Alundi forces grow. This helped Crucio become discouraged from wanting to take revenge on Calpheon and turned his attention instead on solving conflict within their borders and actually started rebuilding Heidel Castle, abandoning his desire for revenge. This enraged Jordine, feeling as if his king had betrayed him, and in this anger he had a vision. A dream came to him, a message from a mysterious shadow knight. It was around this time that a large light was shot out across the sky. Something that hadn't happened since the Tower of Will was built ages ago by the ancients was that black stones were reportedly coming to life, and savages were becoming more aggressive, and even stranger, dangerous monsters were seen among the savages. Following this event, rumors spread of sudden increase of strangers appearing around Velia, with no memory of their past and a strange dark aura about them. That's us. That's us appearing. That's it for the backstory of where we start off in the world of Black Desert. Let me know what you guys think of vids like this. There's a ton more lore and events within the game I can go over if there's enough interest, but until then, I am booping out. Boop!